I grabbed the safety scissors from my 6-year-old daughter Ava's shaking hands at 2:15 a.m. and the world narrowed to the bathroom light, clumps of hair on the floor, and the tiny voice that barely made sense. Daddy's friends pick one girl for the cellar. I have to be ugly or they'll take me. I sat on the cold tile with her on my lap and my phone buzzing in my pocket like a bad drumbeat, and I called her father with my voice cracking so hard it sounded like someone else's on the line. He answered like it was a normal night and sounded calm in a way that made my hands go cold. "You're delusional," he said flatly. Then he added, "I'm recording this call. The judge will love hearing how you're putting sick ideas in Ava's head." He threatened custody in a tone like he was lecturing about chores, and when I asked him to explain, he laughed and said, "You need help, man. Let the kids see their dad." I kept asking questions and he kept deflecting, and I ended the call shaking even harder than Ava. 2 days later, Madison knocked on my door with big chunks missing from her hair and her mother standing behind her with eyes full of something I recognized as fear. Madison kept murmuring, almost under her breath, "Ava saved me," and her mom answered each time with a tired, "It's okay, honey," but she wouldn't tell me more. Standing there in my kitchen with another child's hair in clumps, I felt a line snap inside me. This was no lone breakdown. I started calling every parent whose daughter had been at his house over the last several weekends, one number after another like throwing a net into dark water. The answers were worse than I could have imagined. 4 other girls told their mothers they'd cut their hair recently. One mother found her daughter keeping a notebook that listed whose turn it was for cellar time and the dates next to names like scores on a sick little calendar. Another mother found her 6-year-old at 1:30 a.m. practicing marker scars on her face in the mirror like it was a game. When I heard those stories, I could feel my chest hollow out and fill with a cold rage that made my voice go tight each time I asked, "Did she say why?" And every parent on the phone said the same thing, things that didn't add up, little rituals, whispered fears, weird rules that sounded like play but weren't play. I drove to Child Protective Services with a folder of photos, hair samples in zip bags, and signed statements from 5 mothers who'd watched their daughters change. I sat across from the caseworker and watched her thumb through the photos with the expression of someone doing paperwork instead of looking at a map to a child's broken life. She told me without any real heat in her voice that children cut hair all the time and that she couldn't open an investigation without signs of physical abuse. "You seem coached," she wrote on her report, and I felt like the ground opened and swallowed my breath. Days slid by after that meeting, and I watched the clock with the kind of terror that eats at you from the inside. I called law enforcement and faced a different kind of dismissal. An officer suggested I work on co-parenting and implied my story was dramatic, that my ex had probably spun him a better yarn. The man on the phone told me to think of the children, that escalating things could be worse for custody. And when I tried to tell him about the notebook and the girls drawing downward stairs, he sighed and said we couldn't act on theories. I made lists, checked names, and replayed Ava's whisper in my head until the words had worn grooves. The notebook entries, the marker scars, the girls shaving small patches or chopping their hair off in the dark, those were all signs I'd been told to watch for now. But every time I took them to someone with the power to act, I met a closed door or a note that said no probable cause. It felt like every hand I reached out to pushed a paper of excuses between us and the danger. One mother, Laura, became my last hope when she brought me a box from under Emily's bed labeled before, filled with the hair Emily had cut off and with drawings of stairs and a basement door. She told me about her daughter waking up in the night whispering about being chosen and about how Emily started hiding under the bed and refusing baths. Laura's face when she said, "I counted 72 hours until her next visit," is carved into my mind. That number became a countdown I couldn't ignore. I begged lawyers on phone calls that left me raw, and one of them finally said the words that felt like a knife. If I refused the court order and tried to keep Ava, I could lose custody forever. My options tightened like a vice: fight in court at risk of losing everything, or do something I'd always been taught never to do and hope the law would forgive me later. I looked at Ava sleeping that night, hair half thin with ragged edges, and I knew I couldn't hand her back like nothing had happened. By the time I decided to act, I'd already lined up friends who'd been trained in ways that could help. A cousin who'd been military police and a neighbor who wouldn't blink at getting his hands dirty. We moved with a kind of ugly precision that felt like prayer and sin at the same time, because the law can't always move fast enough when a child's life is on a clock. I didn't own a cape that night. I had a car, a key, and a fury so large I could barely speak, and that drove me forward while my phone rang and the minutes burned away. I had a shoebox of hair under my arm before I even finished talking to Laura, and the clock in my head started ticking loud and cruel, 48 hours until Ava's next visit. Emily had been the one who broke something in me, Laura showed me photos of her long blonde hair and then the shoebox labeled before stuffed with braids and ponytails that smelled faintly of shampoo and loss. Emily had stopped talking the same way after she was chosen for the cellar. She'd started sleeping under her bed and drawing dark stares, and the way Laura said, "She counts them sometimes," made the whole house spin for me. I tried the police again because what else could I do besides calling people with badges? The officer who answered my call smirked like I'd told a joke he wasn't in on and suggested maybe I work on co-parenting. He slid the photos of Ava and the other girls back across the desk as if they were nothing heavier than receipts. I told him about the notebook and the marker scars and the shoebox, and he raised an eyebrow and said, "Your ex called ahead. He said you might show up with wild claims." The words landed like a slap, and for a second I saw my life from the outside, someone yelling into silence. That night, Ava stood in front of the bathroom mirror and traced the tiny stubble at her hairline with a finger like a kid testing a bruise. She sounded flat like someone repeating homework when she said, "I'll have to go down next time." The way she said "have to" made it permanent inside me, like grammar had turned to law. I tried to swallow the panic and make something practical instead. Checked my phone for calls, texted the cousin who could pick locks if needed, and paced until dawn while Ava slept curled up small and fragile in her bed. I called my lawyer because I had to hear the worst out loud. He told me plainly that refusing the court-ordered visitation could cost me legal custody. "You can be held in contempt," he said, and for a moment the words felt like chains wrapping slow and sure. I asked him if there was any legal loophole, any emergency motion, any judge who would listen on a weekend. He sighed and said the judges don't like parents who take children away from the other parent without clear evidence of immediate harm. I told him about the shoebox, the notebook, the girls practicing ugly faces. He said those were red flags, but not always enough without a direct physical injury. The choice felt unreal: save my daughter now with my hands or risk losing everything by trying. 18 hours turned into a library of worst-case scenarios. I imagined walking into a courtroom and being asked why I disobeyed a court order and losing. I imagined handing Ava back and watching her shrink again in a house that scored little girls for beauty like a sick game. I took a breath and tried to think like someone who had to move, not just feel. I called Marcus, my cousin who'd been military police, and told him to be ready in 20 minutes. He didn't ask questions. He said, "Give me a location," and I told him the address like it was a spell to ward off fate. We planned for minimal harm and maximum speed. Marcus and his brother Tony would be at the porch, two friends would stand by the driveway, and I would drive Ava to school if we succeeded. We agreed on signals, on what to do if a neighbor called the cops, on how to handle being arrested ourselves if the worst came. Making that plan felt like stepping off a cliff with a rope knotted by people who loved us. It also felt illegal, raw, and undeniably necessary, because everything else had been doors slammed in my face. Before we left, I sat on the edge of Ava's bed and tried to give her something that wasn't fear. I braided a small lock of her hair, there wasn't much left, and whispered, "No matter what happens, Daddy's here." She looked up with that old 6-year-old honesty and said, "Don't make me ugly again, Daddy." The plea tore me in two. We moved out into the night with the shoebox in the trunk, and a plan that smelled like grief and hope. And the 18 hours between us and her next visit narrowed like a hallway with lights going out one by one. I called my cousin Marcus and said, "Plain, we have to move now." He didn't ask why or give me time to explain. Marcus said, "Tell me where," and I did, voice shaking but steady. 20 minutes later, Marcus and his brother Tony pulled into my driveway like thunder after lightning, and I watched them step out with the calm of people who had seen worse and decided to fix it anyway. Other mothers were walking their girls up to the front door when Marcus walked onto the porch and the air changed. You could see the smile drain off my ex's face like paint washing away. My ex tried to keep control with that practiced grin and a voice that meant business, not fear, until he saw Marcus. He barked, "What are you doing here?" And Marcus said low and plain, "Go inside." The girlfriend tried to bolt for the back door like a scared rabbit, and Tony was already in the kitchen before she hit the hall. He grabbed her, spun her around, and in seconds had zip ties tight around her wrists and her legs secured to the chair as if he'd done it 1,000 times. She screamed and cried out, "You can't do this." But she was pinned and breathing hard, and the house had gone quiet in the way a storm goes quiet before lightning strikes. Marcus walked to the cellar door without looking at anyone like he had every right to be there, and he picked 3 different locks in seconds. I stood at the top of the wooden steps and watched as the latch clicked and the old hinges groaned open. My ex suddenly sounded small and thin. "You don't understand. This is about making girls humble." He reached for explanation and for sympathy, but the girlfriend started talking too much, words tumbling out like a desperate child. She said loudly, "We choose them so they learn. We rank them by how suitable they are. The pretty ones go down so they understand. Her mouth moved like it was reading from a script she had been fed. I recorded every word she said because words are proof when bodies look fine and folders look empty. I kept my phone steady even though my hand shook like winter branches. I said into the recorder, "You need to tell me everything." She babbled about beauty and modesty and how they had lists, and I felt rage lift in me like a storm wind. "You can't rank children for that," I told her, voice low, and she shouted back, "You don't get it, it's about respect." I walked to the top of the stairs and said, "We're going down." My feet hit the first step, and the wood answered with a long creak as if it were warning me to stop. The air at the bottom hit sharp and cold and sorta chemical, like old basements do, and the single bare bulb above swung slow and threw a weak yellow that made everything look tired and scared. The mattress on the floor was stained like someone had tried to scrub away a memory and failed. A tripod stood facing the bed and a camera sat empty on it, and SD cards littered the worktable like bad confetti. Rope coils lay beside metal anchors bolted into the concrete like someone had plans and wanted them to stay. The place smelled like sweat and old plastic and fear, and I filmed it all because I needed help to know what I was seeing. On the work table, I found a pink notebook with stickers peeling off the cover, something you'd buy for a kid, not a crime scene, and the inside made my stomach flip. Dates were written down in neat little rows with initials beside them, A for Ava, M for Madison, ER for Emily Rose. The initials repeated like a turning wheel, and some weekends had a circle around a name like "that girl was picked." Some pages had notes like "unsuitable" or "needs more humility" scrawled in a grown-up hand. The pattern read like a schedule or a ledger, and it made me sick the way a man feels after swallowing something that won't come back up. Marcus took the notebook and said, "Flat, this is all we need." I filmed him as he bagged SD cards and wrapped them in evidence tape because I wanted to have proof that we hadn't made things up. My ex cried out from the top of the stairs, "You're ruining my life," and the girlfriend kept saying, "It's for their own good," like a broken record. I kept recording, my chest tight, hands shaking, because the rotten logic needed to be heard and because silence would let them hide behind words again. The notebook, the camera, the bolts in the wall, those things didn't lie. And I felt both a sick relief and a new layer of fear knowing what we now had to prove. Marcus and Tony kept my ex and his girlfriend zip-tied to kitchen chairs while I dialed 911 and tried to make my hands stop shaking long enough to document everything. I filmed the tied couple, the cellar door, the pink notebook, and the camera tripod because I knew words would get twisted later and I needed raw proof. I asked Marcus to stay calm and to keep them from reaching anything sharp. He nodded once and moved like a man who'd seen too much violence already and didn't need to talk about it. A neighbor in curlers came over when she heard shouted voices, and when she saw the cellar, she put her hand to her mouth and said, "I thought I heard crying sometimes, but I assumed kids fight." She agreed to give a statement and to testify that she'd heard strange sounds coming from that house in the night. Her voice was shaky when she said it, but it mattered because ordinary people noticing things is the only way police take patterns seriously sometimes, and she had noticed. 2 patrol cars rolled up before the detective arrived. The first officers looked at us like they had a simple job: arrest people for unlawful entry. I told them where the girls were, what we'd found, and pointed them to the cellar. Their faces shifted from procedural frowns to something colder when they saw the mattress and the camera gear. One officer asked if we understood we could be charged with breaking in, and I said flat, we were saving kids. The words felt both reckless and honest coming out of my mouth. Detective Carl Monroe showed up with a different energy. Older, measured, but attentive the minute he walked in and saw the cellar. He clicked on his body camera and asked us to step back while he assessed the scene. When he saw the mattress, the rope anchors, and the tripods, his tone changed from suspicious to focused. He asked me to tell him everything while his camera recorded. I handed over my videos and the pink notebook and explained the notebook's initials, the dates, and the circles around names. He listened without interrupting, and then started bagging evidence himself with rubber gloves. Detective Monroe photographed the mattress stains, the anchors bolted into concrete, the coiled ropes, and the whiteboard I'd spotted earlier in the garage covered with initials and dates. He spoke quietly into his radio and secured an emergency warrant to pull footage off the SD cards on site. I watched him work like a professional, methodical, as if he were carving space to make sure we didn't lose a single piece of truth. He thanked the neighbor for coming forward and told her they'd likely need her testimony. Forensics arrived with boxes and plastic tubs and took over the evidence collection. They labeled SD cards, swabbed surfaces, and boxed rope and camera equipment. I stood to the side filming them for my own record because I'd learned not to trust that bureaucracy would hold everything safe. While the forensics techs worked, Detective Monroe found and photographed a whiteboard in the garage with initials, dates, and red circles marking unsuitable. Those notes matched the pink notebook in a way that pulled the whole ugly system into focus. The girlfriend kept insisting we didn't understand that they were building character and teaching humility. She kept talking, and every sentence she said was caught on my phone and on the detective's body camera, and the words only tightened the case. "We were teaching them respect," she said, voice high and frantic. "You don't get it, the girls needed to learn." Hearing her say it out loud and seeing the notebook's schedule next to the camera equipment made it impossible to call this anything but organized psychological abuse. Marta Reyes from CPS came as soon as Detective Monroe called her, and she was furious in a way that felt like relief. She placed emergency protective holds on all 7 girls and coordinated transport to the Child Advocacy Center. She told me, "We should have seen this sooner," and I could hear real anger in her voice for the earlier missed chances. She arranged vans and a team of trained interviewers who work specifically to avoid contaminating children's statements. And she explained gently that the forensic interviews would be done by professionals trained to let kids tell their stories in safe ways. The Advocacy Center vans pulled up and staff in plain shirts led the girls into separate rooms for interviews with specialists trained to use play and drawing instead of leading questions. I watched the vans leave with a hollow sort of hope clenching my chest. Detective Monroe showed me early footage he'd already pulled from one SD card. It was small, unpolished clips of girls crying on the stairs, hands covering mouths and lines of names and dates on the whiteboard. He said softly, "This will change the way the system handles multi-child patterns after this." And I wanted to believe him with a fierceness that surprised me. By the time the vans left, the house was swarming with officers and forensics people, and the scene felt like it was finally being taken seriously. I stayed on the porch while the detective wrapped evidence and Marta organized the girls' care. My voice was hoarse, my hands still shook, but I felt something like a beginning, proof collected, kids protected, and a blue line of people finally recognizing that what we'd been whispering about was real and dangerous. Detective Monroe sat in the squad car with me while he scrolled through footage from one SD card and a phone. We watched short clips that felt like milestones in hell. Little girls on the cellar steps crying, hands over mouths, faces wet with tears, while a man's voice off camera said, "The prettiest one goes down." The words hit me like a physical shove, and I leaned forward until my forehead almost touched the glass. I kept recording the screen with my phone because I wanted another copy, and because proof felt like armor. The footage matched everything we'd found in the house: the pink notebook, the whiteboard in the garage, the rope anchors, and the tripod aimed at the mattress. Each piece fit together like tiles in a picture that was ugly and complete. I walked Monroe through names and dates and pointed to the initials circled in the notebook. He nodded, took notes, and said, "This is staggered, planned, and repeated." When he said planned, it landed like a hammer on my chest because it meant it wasn't a one-off freak event but a system. When they brought the girlfriend in for questioning, she looked smaller, like someone who had run out of stories to tell. At first, she tried to stick to the character-building line, saying, "We just wanted the girls to learn humility." But Monroe did what good detectives do. He played clips, showed her the notebook, and laid out her own words from the house on the table. She started to break. She told them how they ranked the girls, how they used weekends to evaluate suitability, and how the prettiest were chosen to go down and be taught. Her voice sounded hollow when she said it, as if the words were foreign to her mouth. Her cooperation was the pivot the case needed. Prosecutors moved fast once they had her full statements because her testimony connected the schedule, the footage, and the acts in the cellar into a legal pattern that prosecutors could use to charge more than just a bad judgment. The assistant district attorney called Monroe and asked for immediate arrests. When they took my ex and his girlfriend into custody, I felt a mix of relief and a strange numbness, like being at the top of a hill after a long climb. I stood outside the station and watched as officers read them rights and led them away in cuffs. Marcus and Tony were questioned, not like criminals but like people who had interfered with a crime to stop it. The detective told me they would likely face minor charges for restraining people without authority, but he also said Marcus and Tony had prevented ongoing harm and that the charges would be considered in that light. They were released to help investigators organize timelines and witness lists. I remember Marcus rubbing his jaw and saying, "We did what any decent man would do," and Tony adding, "We'd do it again." They didn't sound proud, they sounded like people who had been forced into a hard choice and had taken it. The county's child advocacy team stepped in and coordinated counseling and forensic interviews for each girl. Marta Reyes from CPS worked with the advocates to make sure the girls were seen by professionals trained to ask non-leading questions and to handle trauma sensitively. I sat through parts of the planning, and when Marta said, "We'll keep them safe and make sure they have consistent therapy," I felt a small relief that someone with authority was finally using it. Vans moved the children to the center in small groups with therapists holding their hands, and I watched them go with my throat tight and my hands empty. Detective Monroe promised the case would be handled thoroughly and said quietly, "We're going to build this from as many angles as possible." He listened to every witness, pulled phone records, and coordinated with forensics to pull metadata from the SD cards and phones. The footage timestamps matched visitation weekends and showed girls arriving awkward and leaving more hollow. The metadata painted a timeline that backed up what mothers had told me on the phone and what the pink notebook had outlined. Prosecutors added conspiracy charges because the girlfriend's statements made it clear that multiple people had organized and participated in the system. The added charges were important because they allowed the state to show an organized plan rather than accidental cruelty. I sat in a small interview room and watched them file documents and watched the detective, methodical, tired, work the case like someone trying to patch a leaking dam. The legal paperwork was thick and cold, but it meant the system was finally using its language to trap the truth. Witness statements from other parents, the neighbor who'd heard crying in curlers, and the recordings from the cellar all folded into the prosecution file. The evidence was messy and human: hair in bags, drawings of stairs, a shoebox labeled before, and a string of small girls' voices saying ugly and it's my turn, but it formed a mosaic that couldn't be ignored. I felt every one of those pieces like weights on my chest and like the making of a future that could hold them safer. When the arrest paperwork was done, Detective Monroe took me aside and said, "You did the hard thing when others didn't." He didn't offer sympathy like words. He offered a plan to keep the girls protected and to push charges forward. His hand closed on my shoulder for a second, and that small touch felt like permission to breathe just a little. I left the station that night knowing the legal fight had just begun, but also knowing the kids were out of that house, and that the system, finally moving, might hold those who built that system to account. The emergency protective hearing felt like a courtroom and a reckoning all at once, and I sat there with my hands clenched because I'd done something nobody would cheer for in public even if it saved children. The judge stared at me first, his eyes tired and exact, and he told me I'd taken the law into my own hands and shouldn't have. His words hit hard, and I said nothing because I'd expected the scolding and because scolding wouldn't unmake the nights Ava had described. Then the judge leaned over the bench and read the facts with a steadier voice, and that was when the room flipped. He spoke about the evidence, the footage, the notebook, the whiteboard, and the pattern of girls' changing behaviors that pointed to something systematic and dangerous. He said previous reports had been missed or dismissed and that the court couldn't ignore the clear pattern in front of them now. His decision removed the girls from their father's custody that day, saying their safety had to come first, and I felt a sharp relief that tasted like iron. The judge granted me temporary full custody of Ava, but he made it clear CPS would monitor our family closely and that I had to follow guidelines meant to stabilize Ava's life. "We'll do check-ins," he said, and I nodded because I wanted the checks, the rules, and any accountability that would keep us steady. The legal papers had an odd mix of protection and reproach. I was both praised for saving a child and warned for acting outside the law. It felt like the world acknowledging both my sins and my reasons. The girlfriend agreed to a cooperation deal with prosecutors in exchange for a lighter sentence, and her statements became a linchpin for the case. She described the ranking system, the whiteboard, and how choices were made on weekends to determine who went down to the cellar. Her voice in recorded interviews sounded smaller than the one I'd filmed at the house, and in court she looked hollow and tired. Prosecutors used her words to show a conspiracy rather than an isolated incident, and that made their case much stronger. Detective Monroe and the assistant district attorney worked quickly, building a file that linked the notebook, the footage, and witness statements into something a judge and a jury could understand. The pressure from the file pushed my ex toward a plea deal to avoid putting the girls through live testimony, and the offer was ugly but practical. He could take a shorter sentence and avoid a public trial that would drag the children back through trauma. When the plea deal came through, I felt a mix of vindication and grief that justice didn't always look like the scene in a movie. The other mothers and I became a different kind of family after that. The mothers who sat in court, visited therapists, and drove to hearings together. We pooled whatever money we could to cover therapy, legal fees, and extra help because the system's support wasn't always enough. We passed therapist referrals like trading secret maps, shared lawyer numbers, and formed a weekly routine of dinners where the kids could play while we compared notes and held each other up. It mattered that we weren't alone when the legal wheels turned slowly. Our support group turned into real work too. We went to the Child Advocacy Center together, volunteered for awareness events, and helped each other through the paperwork maze. We lobbied for better responses at CPS and pushed for training that would make calloused caseworkers ask different questions when multiple girls from one house showed similar behaviors. I still sold off family things to pay for a retainer on top of what the group raised. And I slept in bursts for a long time, but the dinners and the ride-alongs to therapy felt like anchors. Ava's healing was jagged and slow, and some nights she screamed or clung to me like she was afraid I might vanish. But we had therapists who taught her breathing, art, and ways to say things without reliving them. The girls met in small groups and eventually played together without anyone directing them. I watched them once at a park, hair tied up in simple ponytails, laughing like kids do when they don't have to be brave. It wasn't the end of our work, but it was real proof that rescue could turn into recovery when people kept showing up, when the law finally listened, and when a handful of tired parents refused to let children be left invisible. Recovery was slow and jagged, like walking on broken glass and learning not to notice every cut at once, and I watched it with a kind of careful terror. Ava's early therapy sessions were brutal. She woke me screaming from bad dreams, hated the dark, and clung to me like I might vanish. "It's okay, Daddy," I would tell her, and she'd press her small body against mine and breathe until the storm passed. The therapist taught her to name feelings, anger, fear, shame, and to breathe through them. And the first time she used a breathing exercise on her own, I cried in the kitchen until my hands stopped shaking. School tried hard not to make her feel different, and the staff quietly made changes so she could heal without being spotlighted. They set up a buddy system for bathroom breaks and had a safe adult she could go to if panic hit. "We'll keep this normal for her," the counselor told me, and for once I believed someone else could carry some of the load. Ava's teachers met with her therapist, and we worked out small plans that let her feel protected while still being a kid in class. There were setbacks. One winter night she refused to sleep in her room for a week, but then there were tiny victories, like her walking into school without dragging her feet. Months after the arrests, the family court granted me permanent legal custody, and the judge put strict conditions on my ex's contact with the girls, supervised visits only if he completed treatment and follow-up programs. I remember the judge saying, "We will protect these children first," and the way the gavel sounded like a door finally closing on that chapter. I felt relief so deep it surprised me, but I also felt hollow because a lot of damage doesn't have an off switch. Still, the court order meant I could breathe and plan without looking over my shoulder every weekend. Marcus and Tony finished their community service and turned the experience into something useful, teaching self-defense classes for local women. They stayed close to our families, dropping by with tools or casseroles and never acting like heroes, just like people who'd done what needed to be done. Marcus told me once quietly, "We didn't sign up to be in a courtroom, man, we just wanted the kids safe," and Tony laughed and said, "And now we teach kicks and common sense." Their presence became a steady thing in our lives, part muscle and part warmth. The girls took steps to own their bodies back. One bright Saturday, we all went to a hair salon and agreed to get shorter cuts together, not because anyone forced them, but because they wanted to choose. They sat in a row, chattered like kids at a sleepover, and each one left the chair with a grin and a pile of hair in a bag labeled new. Ava picked a purple ribbon after, she said, "I wanted to braid something pretty, that's mine." I watched them choose styles and laugh over silly headbands, and felt something like restoration settling into my chest. Therapy continued, and it was messy work, art that turned from dark stares into suns and messy drawings that slowly lost the cellar door. They painted, built blanket forts, practiced dances, and argued over which movie to watch while their mothers or I kept the snacks ready. I sat in waiting rooms and ate bad vending machine coffee while they learned to play without scripts. We tracked triggers, celebrated progress, and shared hard nights at weekly dinners where we passed tissues and hot food and let the kids run wild. Years passed with fits and stops, but the pattern of harm loosened like a knot after enough patience and kind routines. We hosted barbecues where the girls ran through sprinklers and drew chalk rainbows on the driveway, and I braided a ribbon into Ava's hair before bed with hands that had once trembled at scissors. "Check under the bed," she asked, half joking, and I did it out of habit. No scissors, only dust bunnies and a toy dinosaur. She climbed under the covers with her stuffed unicorn and tucked it tight, and for the first time in a long time she breathed easy. We kept some scars. Some nights she woke up or flinched at loud noises, and we went back to therapy plans and checked our instincts. But more often now I watched her play, hear her laugh, and forget to be vigilant for a few hours. Friends came into our life, Mark from the hardware store who built Legos with her, and people from the advocacy group who became true friends. We volunteered when we could and spoke at prevention events. I told others what to watch for because silence had almost ruined my child. When I lie down at night now and listen to Ava breathe in the next room, I still hold the memory of that shoebox and the pink notebook like a scar that taught me things. But I also hold the sound of her laugh from the sprinkler and the purple ribbon in her hair. We want to fight no single person should have to fight, and the victory doesn't always feel clean, but it's real. She sleeps, she dreams small normal dreams, and for now that is enough. I still wake up sometimes with my fists tight and my heart racing, but Detective Monroe found me one afternoon and said straight, "We need you." He wanted me to help train officers on the signs we'd missed, and I agreed because I didn't want another parent to face what we did alone. I stood in front of a room full of people in uniforms and told them about hair clumps in zip bags, about a pink notebook with initials, about girls practicing ugly faces in the mirror, and about neighbors who hear crying but think it's just kids being rough. I said it flat and blunt because that's what stuck. Patterns, not isolated acts, point to something worse. Detective Monroe and I walked through footage and notes together, and then he let me explain the little things that looked like play but meant harm. I told them how repeated hair cutting across children from one house wasn't a fad but a signal, and how notebooks listing turns for a seller should set off alarm bells. I played the recordings where the girlfriend explained their suitability system and watched faces in the room shift as officers realized the evidence was psychological, slow building, and deliberate. When I talked about kids drawing stairs going down, the room went quiet like people hearing a siren. They asked practical stuff, what to ask worried parents without leading them, how to collect small physical evidence like hair bits and notebooks, and when to take allegations seriously even if there were no bruises. I told them to act sooner when similar behaviors cropped up in different families. We built checklists, wrote new intake scripts, and recommended forensic interviewers be brought in earlier. The county rewrote protocols so that multiple complaints from different families trigger a full investigation. And suddenly the system had a new rulebook on psychological abuse that looked at patterns, not just single bruises. Marta from CPS came to some sessions and nodded while we went through case studies. She helped shape the new triage system so reports about emotional harm wouldn't be pushed aside. "We missed signs before," she said plain, and I felt less alone when she spoke like that. Detectives and caseworkers started cross-checking visitation weekends with school reports and neighbor calls. Phone metadata and SD card timestamps became routine pulls. The change didn't fix everything overnight, but it made the next parent who came in with a shoebox of hair feel less like they were banging on a locked door. The mothers stayed close in ways that mattered every day, sharing rides to therapy, trading babysitting on nights when legal fees swallowed a paycheck, and leaving casseroles on each other's porches. We scheduled playdates where the kids could just be kids, and the women who'd sat across from me in court became a network of adults who knew the language of trauma and the law. We held weekly dinners, brought brownies to therapists, and passed referrals like lifelines. I watched them become friends, fierce and practical, and I kept a spot in my car for whoever needed a ride. I met someone simple who listened without judgment and made the small things feel like everything. Mark from the hardware store who showed up with tools and patience and built a sandbox for the girls. He didn't try to fix the past, he just sat on the porch and let Ava lead the conversation. He asked about her favorite cartoons and helped her build a Lego castle without asking invasive questions. When he stayed, it taught me slowly that men can do quiet repair without great speeches, just showing up and folding normal life back around a child. Months after the trial, Ava signed us up to volunteer at prevention workshops at the Advocacy Center. I went with her because I wanted to be where she felt safe and proud. She sat on a small chair and told a younger girl in a soft voice, "Sometimes people act like monsters, but there are always heroes." The little girl looked up at Ava with wide eyes and then smiled, and I felt something lift off my chest like a weight I'd carried for years. That line, so plain and brave, said everything I wanted to teach the world about fear and courage. We still watch for signs and we still carry scars, but the lightness has space to breathe into our days. The girls run through sprinklers in the summer and chalk the driveway with bright rainbows that don't hide stairs. We picnic on blankets, joke about silly things, and teach kids how to ask for help without shame. I braid a purple ribbon into Ava's hair sometimes and check under the bed out of habit, then laugh at myself when I find only dust and dinosaurs. She sleeps with her stuffed unicorn and breathes easy now. And when I listen to that steady sound at night, I know we did more than survive. We rebuilt something safe enough for children to be children again.